All right, so today we're diving headfirst into Wall Street, into one of those stories where the line between brilliance and deception can get, well, pretty blurry.
You know, it's fascinating
Yeah.
because the figure we're going to tackle today, Michael Milken, really embodies the question we're always trying to answer: grifter or gifted?
Right, because this is the guy who built a fortune, but also ended up with a criminal record.
Yeah, exactly.
And even today, people are still arguing about whether he was a true visionary who democratized Wall Street or just a really, really good manipulator who took advantage of the system.
Absolutely.
Now, most people probably know him as the junk bond king, right? That's the label that always gets attached to him.
Well, that's the one that stuck.
Yeah. But does that really capture the essence of who Milken was? Or is that just scratching the surface?
Well, that's the challenge, isn't it? I mean, how do you look beyond those catchy headlines and really dissect the man, his methods, and the impact he had? Because the answers are not simple.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock a bit and go back to Milken's early days. We know he was really almost obsessively interested in what were then called junk bonds.
Right. High yield, high risk.
Yeah, the bonds that traditional investors wouldn't even touch.
Too risky.
What was it about those risky investments that drew him in?
Well, you see, Milken saw opportunity where everyone else saw danger.
Okay.
He really believed, and this was based on his academic research, that these bonds were significantly undervalued. He saw the potential not just for making a profit, which he certainly did, but for reshaping the entire financial world.
So he wasn't just out there chasing a quick buck. He had a much bigger vision in mind.
Oh, much, much bigger.
Okay.
So he joined this firm called Drexel Burnham Lambert and basically started building a whole network of buyers for these junk bonds, creating a new market, really.
So he just, made the market himself.
It was revolutionary, really, because all of a sudden, companies that were considered too risky to get traditional bank loans had access to capital.
So companies that no one else would touch.
Exactly.
Give me an example.
Okay, think about MCI.
MCI, the...
Telecommunications, yeah.
Yeah, right, the big phone company.
They couldn't get funding the conventional way, so Milken stepped in.
Wow, so are you saying that without Milken and his junk bonds, MCI might never have become the giant that it did?
That's a real possibility.
That's huge.
And keep in mind, MCI is just one example.
Oh, right.
He financed thousands of companies.
The thousands.
Many of which went on to become very successful, creating jobs and driving economic growth.
Okay, so that definitely sounds like the gifted side of the equation.
Right.
But it wasn't just about the money, right? Milken seemed to really see himself as a disruptor, someone who was, taking on the whole Wall Street establishment.
Oh, absolutely. He challenged that whole hierarchy.
Which at that time was...
favoring large, well-established corporations.
Right, the blue chips and so on.
You know, unlike figures like J.P. Morgan, who are all about consolidating power and limiting competition, Milken wanted to, in his words, open up access to capital for everybody, for all kinds of companies.
So it was all about creating a more dynamic and inclusive economy, one that he argued would benefit everyone.
That was the argument, yeah.
Okay, it's definitely a compelling argument.
Yeah.
But isn't it also possible that this was just, Milken rationalizing his actions? Maybe it was really about profit first and foremost, with the democratization of finance just being a convenient story he could tell.
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Was there some genuine altruism behind what he did, or was that all a clever facade?
Yeah, that's tough to figure out.
To really try and unravel that, we need to delve into how his methods actually worked.
Okay.
And that leads us to, it leads us to leveraged buyouts.
Leveraged buyouts.
Yeah.
Okay, break that down for me.
So imagine this. Milken would use these junk bonds to finance the takeover of companies.
Oh.
Often by groups of investors or even sometimes the company's own management.
Interesting.
And these buyouts were highly leveraged, meaning they relied heavily on borrowed money.
And that borrowed money was...
those high-risk, high-yield bonds, the junk bonds.
I see. So he was basically using junk bonds to fuel these takeovers.
Exactly.
Which allowed smaller players to compete for acquisitions that they normally wouldn't even have a chance at, right?
Right. They could punch above their weight.
It's almost like a high-stakes game of financial chess, with junk bonds being his weapon of choice.
That's a great way to put it.
But this strategy, even though it could fuel rapid growth, it also carried a lot of risk. Right.
Immense risk.
Because if those companies couldn't generate enough cash flow to service their debt, the whole thing could just collapse.
Absolutely.
And that inherent risk is what led to a lot of the criticism directed at Milken, I imagine.
That's right, because, when things go wrong in the financial world, they can go very wrong.
And that brings us to the turning point in Milken's story. his fall from grace.
A fall.
In 1986, one of his clients, Ivan Budetsky, was arrested for insider trading.
Oh, yeah.
And in a plea deal, he implicated Milken.
Yeah, that was the beginning of the end, really.
It must have been a pretty dramatic downfall.
Oh, it was. Milken was eventually charged with all sorts of things. Racketeering, securities fraud.
A whole slew of financial crimes.
He fought it at first, said he was innocent, claimed he was being targeted because he was challenging the establishment, but eventually
He pled guilty.
pled guilty to 6 felony counts, including securities and reporting violations.
Okay, but even though he pled guilty, some people still maintain that he was justified in what he did.
Right.
That he was just bending the rules.
Pushing the boundaries, yeah.
So what's the evidence to support that side of the argument? What do his supporters say?
Well, they point out that a lot of the practices Milken was accused of, things like stock manipulation, parking stock, creating artificial demand to inflate prices, they say those practices were common on Wall Street at the time.
So everyone was doing it.
And that he was being singled out because he was so successful, because he disrupted the status quo.
It's a matter of perspective then, right?
Right.
Whether he was a savvy operator pushing the boundaries or a deliberate rule breaker.
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure.
But in the end, he pled guilty. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison.
10 years, yes, although it was later reduced to 2.
2 years.
But the damage was done. His
Yeah.
reputation was tarnished. His Wall Street career was over.
It was a huge fall from grace.
Really was.
But instead of focusing on the specific charges against him, I'm more interested in how Milken himself justified his actions.
Okay.
What did he have to say about all the accusations? Did he ever admit to any wrongdoing?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I think to understand his perspective, we need to look at what happened next, after he served his time. Because instead of just fading away, Milken reemerged with a whole new focus. Philanthropy.
Philanthropy, huh? That's
Right.
a fascinating twist.
It is, isn't it? It adds another layer of complexity to his story.
It definitely does.
So after prison, Milken dedicated himself to giving back, particularly in areas like medical research and education. You know, he became a major advocate for prostate cancer awareness and research after he was diagnosed with the disease himself in the early 90s.
Right. And it was a pretty serious diagnosis, wasn't it?
Yeah, they gave him a very bleak prognosis.
Wow. But instead of just accepting his fate, he went out and found treatment and beat the odds.
He did, and that experience seemed to have a profound impact on him.
I bet.
He went on to establish the Prostate Cancer Foundation.
Oh, wow.
Which has poured millions of dollars into research and really played a big role in advancing treatment options and improving survival rates.
That's amazing. It's a really powerful example of how someone can turn a personal struggle into a force for good.
It is.
But his philanthropic efforts weren't limited to healthcare, right? He also focused on education reform.
That's right, especially in underserved communities.
So he was trying to make a difference beyond just the medical field.
Yeah, he became a strong advocate for charter schools,
Interesting.
believing that they could offer these innovative educational opportunities to students who might otherwise be left behind.
Right. He also funded scholarship programs and other initiatives aimed at improving access to quality education for disadvantaged kids. So the question is, are we seeing genuine altruism here? Or is this all a calculated attempt to rehabilitate his image after the scandal?
Right. Is it possible to separate the good deeds from the man's controversial past?
That's the tough question.
Yeah, it continues to fuel debate to this day.
Yeah.
Some argue that his philanthropy is a sincere effort to give back and make amends for his past mistakes.
Okay.
Others see it more skeptically. You know, they think it's a strategic move to rebuild his reputation, to regain public acceptance.
So like a PR move, basically.
In a way, yeah.
But in the end, I guess it's up to each individual to decide what they believe.
Exactly. Weigh the evidence and form your own conclusions.
It is interesting, though, how Milken's approach to philanthropy kind of mirrors his approach to finance. It's like he's always looking for the most effective way to leverage resources and maximize impact.
That's a good point.
Whether it's financing a leveraged buyout or funding a medical research project, he seems driven by this desire to identify opportunities and implement strategies that can really shake things up.
He certainly doesn't shy away from bold moves.
All right, so we've explored Milken's rise, his fall, and his attempts at redemption through philanthropy.
Yeah.
But to understand his lasting impact, I think we need to talk about the so-called Drexel diaspora.
The diaspora.
Who were these people, and how did they shape Wall Street after Milken was gone?
Okay, so the Drexel diaspora refers to the network of financiers who worked under Milken at Drexel Burnham Lambert.
Oh.
Many of them went on to become major players in the financial world, founding their own firms and shaping the industry in pretty profound ways.
So it's like Milken's legacy continued through these individuals, even though he was no longer directly involved.
Exactly. And their success raises some interesting questions.
What?
Like, did they inherit just Milken's financial acumen, his way of thinking about markets?
Okay.
Or did they also pick up some of his more aggressive, maybe even ethically questionable tactics?
That's a good question.
It's a bit of a gray area.
So give me some examples. Who are some of the key figures in this Drexel diaspora?
Well, there's Ken Moyles.
Ken Moyles, yeah.
He worked directly under Milken in Drexel's high-yield bond department.
So he was right in the thick of it.
He was, and later he went on to found Milken Company,
Which is?
a leading global investment bank.
Wow.
And he's just one example.
Okay, who else?
Leon Black, who co-founded Apollo Global Management, another giant in the world of private equity, he also started at Drexel.
So these guys learned from Milken, adapted his methods, and went on to achieve incredible success.
Absolutely.
But success in the world of high finance, especially back then, often came with a pretty hefty price tag, right? Didn't some of Milken's protégés face criticism for continuing a culture of greed and short-termism on Wall Street?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Some critics argue that the Drexel diaspora played a big role in normalizing aggressive deal-making, excessive risk-taking.
And really focusing on those short-term profits over long-term value creation.
So, in a way, they were continuing the legacy that Milken started, but maybe not in a good way.
Right, and that raises concerns about the ethical implications of Milken's influence.
It also goes back to that central question, doesn't it? Did Milken ultimately change the world for better or worse?
Yeah, I mean, his supporters will point to all the companies he helped finance, the jobs he created, the dynamism he brought to the economy.
And his critics will argue that his legacy is one of greed and excess, of pushing ethical boundaries too far.
Exactly. It's a complex and nuanced legacy.
For sure.
It's hard to categorize neatly.
To really grasp it, I think we need to consider not just Milken's individual actions, but also the broader context, right?
Absolutely, the systemic context.
Oh, what do you mean by that?
Well, think about the regulatory environment of the 1980s.
Right, it's a different time.
The culture on Wall Street, the incentives that were in place.
Yeah, it was a time of, well, a lot of excess. So was Milken simply a product of his time? Was he just exploiting loopholes and pushing boundaries that were already pretty blurry? Or did he play a more active role in shaping that culture of excess?
Yeah, did he help create the problem?
And did he push the system towards a breaking point?
Those are some really tough questions, and I don't think there are any easy answers.
I agree.
But I think it's important to have these conversations, right?
Definitely.
By examining Milken's story and its ripple effects, we can gain a deeper understanding of the financial world and the ethical challenges it presents.
Absolutely. It's all about recognizing that the pursuit of wealth and innovation, they can have both positive and negative consequences.
And that brilliance can be used for good or for ill.
Exactly.
And ultimately, it's about holding individuals accountable for their actions while also understanding the larger forces at play.
It's a complex equation.
This has been a fascinating deep dive so far.
It has.
But before we wrap up our exploration of Michael Milken, there's one more thought I want to leave our listeners with.
Oh.
So it's like we have this really stark contrast, the meteoric rise, the shocking fall, and then this period of relative silence while Milken served his time.
Yeah.
But what's so fascinating is what happened next.
That happened.
He doesn't fade into obscurity. He reemerges with this whole new focus.
Okay.
Philanthropy.
It's almost like a whole new chapter in his story.
It really is, and it just adds like another layer of complexity to his already complicated legacy.
Oh, absolutely, it does.
So after prison, Milken really dedicates himself to philanthropy,
Yeah.
particularly in medical research and education.
Right, right.
And it's no coincidence, right, that he becomes this huge advocate for prostate cancer awareness and research after he's diagnosed with the disease himself.
In the early 90s.
Yeah, and they gave him a pretty bleak prognosis, didn't they?
It did.
So he's facing his own mortality,
Mm-hmm.
but instead of just giving up, he seeks out treatment and ends up beating the odds.
He does. He really does. And that experience seems to have had a profound impact on him, you know?
Yeah, it's got to change you, right?
I think so.
To face something like that.
Absolutely.
And he goes on to establish the Prostate Cancer Foundation, which has poured millions of dollars into research.
So much money.
And they've played a really significant role in advancing treatment options and improving survival rates for men with prostate cancer.
They have, no doubt about that.
It's pretty remarkable. you
This
know?
is
It's a real example of how someone can take a personal tragedy and turn it into something positive, a force for good.
absolutely. I mean, it's a powerful testament to, human resilience and the desire to make a difference.
But his philanthropic efforts weren't limited to healthcare, right?
Yeah.
He also got really involved in education reform.
Yeah, he did, specifically in underserved communities.
So he was trying to address inequality, give kids opportunities they might not otherwise have.
Yeah, and he was a big believer in charter schools.
Hmm.
He thought they could offer innovative approaches to education, reach students who are falling through the cracks.
Yeah, that was a big debate back then, and it still is today.
Right. But Milken was convinced that charter schools could be a game changer.
He was never afraid to challenge the status quo, was he?
No, not at all, whether it was on Wall Street or in the world of education.
So here's the question that keeps coming up. Are we seeing genuine altruism with all this philanthropy? Or is this just a calculated attempt to, like, rebuild his image after the scandal?
Right. How do we separate the good deeds from his past?
Yeah, can you really separate the two?
It's a tough one. It's a question that's still being debated.
Because some people will say, look, he served his time, he's trying to make amends, give back to society.
Right. They see it as sincere.
But then others are more skeptical.
Yeah.
They see it as a PR move, a way to try to erase his past and regain public acceptance.
It's hard to know what his true motivations were.
Yeah, we can't get inside his head.
But ultimately, I guess it's up to each individual to decide what they believe, right?
To look at the evidence and draw their own conclusions.
Exactly.
It's interesting, though, how his approach to philanthropy kind of mirrors his approach to finance in a way.
How so?
It's like he's always looking for the most effective way to leverage resources, to get the biggest bang for his buck.
To maximize the impact.
Exactly, whether he's financing a leveraged buyout or funding a medical research project.
Right. It's all about strategic thinking, identifying opportunities, and implementing bold solutions.
Okay, so we've talked about his rise, his fall, and his attempts at redemption through philanthropy.
Yeah.
But to really understand his lasting impact, we need to talk about the Drexel diaspora.
Yes, the Diaz.
Who are these people, and how do they shape Wall Street in the wake of Milken's downfall?
Okay, so the Drexel diaspora refers to this network of financiers who all worked under Milken at Drexel Burnham Lambert.
His protégés, essentially.
Yeah, you could say that. And many of them went on to become major players in the financial world.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Founding their own firms, making big deals, shaping the industry in some pretty significant ways.
So it's like Milken's legacy continued through these people.
It did, even though he was no longer directly involved.
That's interesting.
And their success raises some important questions.
Okay, like what?
Like, did they inherit just Milken's financial skills, his knowledge of markets?
Right, just the technical stuff?
Or did they also adopt some of his more, shall we say, aggressive tactics, the stuff that got him into trouble?
The ethically questionable stuff?
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure.
Give me some examples. Who are some of the key figures in this Drexel diaspora?
Well, one of the most prominent is Ken Mullis.
Ken Mullis, okay.
He worked directly under Milken in Drexel's high-yield bond department.
So he was right at the heart of it.
Oh, yeah, he was in the thick of it.
And what happened to him after Drexel collapsed?
Well, he went on to found Mullis and Company,
Mullis and Company.
which is a major global investment bank.
Wow, so he did pretty well for himself.
He did.
And he's just one example, right?
One of many.
Give me another one.
Okay, how about Leon Black?
Leon Black, okay.
He co-founded Apollo Global Management.
Another big player.
Huge. Another giant in the private equity world.
And he also started at Drexel.
He did. Cut his teeth there. Learned the ropes.
So it seems like a lot of Milken's protégés went on to achieve incredible success.
Oh, absolutely.
But success in the world of high finance, especially back then, often came at a cost, didn't it? Weren't some of Milken's former colleagues criticized for perpetuating that culture of, well, greed and excess on Wall Street?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because the 1980s were a pretty wild time, weren't they?
They were.
Lots of money flowing around, lots of risky deals being made.
And some would argue that Milken and his followers played a big role in creating that environment.
Yeah, the critics say they normalized aggressive deal-making, excessive risk-taking.
Short-term profits over long-term value creation.
Yeah, it's like they were all about the quick buck, no matter the consequences.
And that raises some serious concerns about the ethical implications of Milken's legacy.
Right, because even if he was trying to do good later on with his philanthropy, you have to wonder if he also contributed to some of the problems that plague the financial system today.
It's a valid point, and it all circles back to that fundamental question we keep coming back to. Did Milken ultimately change the world for better or
It's
worse?
so hard to say.
It really is. On one hand, you have all those companies he helped finance, the jobs he created, the economic growth he spurred.
He was a catalyst for innovation. There's no doubt about that.
But on the other hand, you have the accusations of greed, manipulation, and disregard for the rules.
The lasting damage to the reputation of Wall Street.
Right, and the sense that he may have helped create a system that's too focused on short-term gains and not enough on long-term sustainability.
It's a complicated legacy, to say the least.
It is, and to really understand it, I think we need to go beyond just looking at Milken's individual actions.
Okay, so what else do we need to consider?
We need to look at the broader context, the systemic forces that were at play.
What do you mean by that?
Think about the regulatory environment of the 1980s, the culture on Wall Street at that time, the incentives that were driving people's behavior.
Okay, so it's not just about Milken himself, it's about the whole system.
Exactly. Was Milken just a product of his time? Was he simply exploiting loopholes that already existed? Or did he actively shape that environment, push the system towards excess and instability?
Yeah, did he help create the rules of the game, or was he just playing them better than anyone else?
It's a tough question, and I don't think there are any easy answers.
They're trying to unravel a giant knot.
Yeah, it's messy and complicated.
But I think it's important to try, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Have these conversations to wrestle with these difficult questions.
It's the only way we can learn from the past and hopefully create a better future.
Because by examining Milken's story and the broader context in which it unfolded, we can gain a deeper understanding of how the financial world works and the ethical challenges it presents.
Right, and those challenges are still with us today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're still grappling with issues of greed, risk, and the pursuit of profit at all costs.
Yeah. And figuring out how to balance innovation with responsibility, how to create a financial system that serves everyone, not just a select few.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive so far.
It has, hasn't it?
But before we wrap up our exploration of Michael Milken, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Imagine, just for a second, that Michael Milken never set foot on Wall Street.
Okay.
What would the financial landscape look like today? Would we have seen the same level of innovation? Would the junk bond market have taken off the way it did? Would we have had all those leveraged buyouts that reshaped corporate America?
It's a great question, a real thought experiment, because Milken's impact was undeniable.
For sure.
Whether you see the changes he brought about as positive or negative, he was a catalyst.
He shook things up.
He challenged the conventional wisdom.
Yeah.
He opened up new avenues for capital, empowered a whole generation of financiers who then went on to, leave their own mark on the world.
But that brings us right back to that fundamental question that we've been wrestling with throughout this entire deep dive.
Right. Back to the beginning.
Grifter or gifted?
The big question.
Because how can someone who broke the law, who manipulated the system for personal gain, also be considered a visionary, a force for good?
It's a question that really forces you to confront, the complexities of human nature, right?
Yeah, because no one's all good or all bad.
Exactly.
Milken was obviously brilliant, incredibly ambitious, driven to succeed.
No doubt about it.
He saw opportunities where everyone else just saw roadblocks.
But he also crossed ethical lines, blurred the boundaries of legality, and ultimately paid the price for his actions.
And his story raises a bigger point, I think, about how we judge success, particularly in the world of finance.
Interesting.
Do we just measure it by the bottom line, by financial returns?
Right, just the numbers.
Or do we also have to factor in the ethical implications?
The impact on society, the long-term consequences.
I think those things matter too, right?
They do, absolutely. And that debate, it goes way beyond just Milken himself.
Oh, for sure.
We see it playing out all the time with powerful figures in all sorts of industries.
Okay, give me an example.
Think about those tech giants, the ones who have amassed these huge fortunes while facing accusations of, monopolistic practices and data privacy violations.
Right, the big tech companies.
Or the pharmaceutical companies that have developed life-saving drugs but are also engaging in, price gouging and misleading marketing tactics.
It seems like there's often this tension between innovation and ethics.
There is.
Between pushing the boundaries and respecting the rules.
And figuring out where that line is, it's rarely straightforward.
It's a gray area, for sure.
A lot of gray.
So what can we learn from Milken's story? What are the takeaways here, the things we can apply to our own lives, whether we're in finance or just, trying to be decent human beings.
Well, I think one key takeaway is the importance of critical thinking.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
We can't just accept things at face value, whether they're being told to us by, charismatic figures like Milken or anyone else who might have an agenda.
We need to be skeptical.
We need to question assumptions, look at the evidence, consider different perspectives.
Don't just believe the hype.
Exactly, because the truth is often more complicated than it appears.
It's about recognizing those shades of gray, right?
Absolutely. Things are rarely black and white.
And another lesson, I think, is the power of resilience.
Resilience.
Because Milken faced some serious adversity.
Oh, he did.
But he didn't give up. He rebuilt his life after a major setback, and he found a way to channel his energy into something positive.
Yeah, he found a new purpose.
So it's a reminder that even when you face failure, you can still find meaning. You can still make a difference.
Absolutely. It's never too late to change course.
And one last point, I think, is that Milken's story really highlights the need for a strong system of checks and balances.
Some balances, yeah.
Whether it's regulations, ethical guidelines, or just a culture of accountability, we need mechanisms in place to prevent abuse of power.
To make sure that people are playing by the rules.
And to ensure that innovation is pursued in a responsible and sustainable way.
Because progress shouldn't come at the expense of our values, our communities, or the well-being of future generations.
Well said, well said.
So I think that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the life and legacy of Michael Milken.
It's been quite a journey.
It has, a thought-provoking one, I think.
For sure.
It's challenged us to confront some uncomfortable truths, to grapple with these complex questions about success, ambition, and the nature of good and evil.
But ultimately, I think it's through these kinds of deep dives, these explorations of the messy realities of power and the human condition, that we can gain a better understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
I agree, and I hope our listeners walk away with a renewed sense of curiosity, a willingness to question things, and a commitment to creating a future where innovation and ethics can coexist.
Because we need both.
Right. We do.
We need progress, but we also need to make sure that progress is being used to benefit everyone, not just a select few.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Michael Milken.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll be back next time with another fascinating individual whose story begs the question: grifter or gifted?